Hello and welcome. Today I want to talk about the most underrated feature in the Souls games, which is that despite a reputation for being difficult and unforgiving, these games are surprisingly good at not wasting the player's time with dull busy work like inventory management. I'm going to talk about how Elden Ring creates a smooth and convenient experience, the importance of quality of life features, and also the potential disadvantages of building convenient games. Elden Ring's inventory system, and that of all the Souls games really, is streamlined and seems intended to limit the amount of time you spend in it. The inventory itself is cleanly split into logical sections, making it easy to find particular items that all have unique icons, and there's no arbitrary weight or quantity limit that interrupts exploration. There's a bottomless box where you can store stuff you don't use for later, preventing your infinite inventory from becoming bloated and unwieldy. The fact that you don't need to go into menus often to sell junk to NPCs or play inventory Tetris really helps with immersion because you spend way more time playing the actual game. When you're doing busy work like sorting your inventory, offloading low value items to NPCs, or moving junk between workbenches so you can craft in Fallout 4, you're not making engaging decisions and it feels like work. I can only dream about how much time would have been saved in Fallout 4 if the inventory your crafting components were stored in worked more like the one in Elden Ring where you always have access to your ingredients. Fallout 4's carry weight system is technically more realistic, but is actually less immersive on a practical basis because it forces you into loading screens as you fast travel back and forth to your base to pick up materials. In fact, Elden Ring affords a lot of convenience to its players in general. Torrent gives players a way to quickly travel across large spaces and a reliable way to run away from enemies that they don't want to fight yet. Fast travel is unlocked from the start, and this combines with the horse to make getting to the content you want to do really easy. Crafting is a painless process and doesn't require you to repeatedly make stuff you don't need to level up some arbitrary skill before you can make what you actually want. You just obtain recipes by exploring the world and then make them. For the most part, they even removed the long runbacks to bosses that the earlier games had by placing checkpoints near the boss room. With Elden Ring, it seems like they went to a lot of effort to make the game as convenient and frictionless as possible, leading to a smooth playing experience where the player can focus on exploring the lands between. At this point, it might seem like I'm advocating for developers to make their games as convenient as possible, but that's actually not the case. Convenience can come with drawbacks, such as reducing the realism of the world. If there's no fast travel and players need to walk everywhere, they'll become much more familiar with the layout of the world as if it was a real place, like in Dark Souls 1. The lack of fast travel for the first half of that game makes the enemies more dangerous and terrifying because they physically impede the player's ability to get around. One of the most memorable moments in Dark Souls 1 is when the player reaches Blighttown, sits at the bonfire, and then realises that they are stuck down there unless they climb all the way out. The feeling of isolation and being out of your depth this provides simply wouldn't have happened if the game had fast travel enabled from the start. There's something about having to physically traverse these places that makes them and the distance between them feel more real. These games also don't include things like mini-maps, which are really common nowadays, and this forces players to actually look at the game world rather than a corner of the screen, and this has the added benefit of reducing UI bloat as well. One example of a convenience feature I wish these games had though is quest journals that keep track of what stage of an NPC quest you're on. Basically, if there's no journal, this means that you need to remember information you're told, which is fine if you play regularly, but if I take a month's break from a game, there's no way I'm going to remember what I was doing the last time I was playing. You can break out the old pen and paper and make your own quest log, but at that point the information might as well just be in the game, especially in 2024 when players are just going to look up the answers on a wiki if the in-game instructions are too obscure. There's one last point I want to make about convenience in these games, and that is to talk about quality of life features. These are features intended to make games easier to play without changing the gameplay itself, which are different to design decisions which do have an effect on gameplay. For example, options like remappable buttons, reduced load times, and user interface improvements are all quality of life features. The reason why I'm bringing this up is because features like fast travel are often called quality of life features because they give players convenience, when in reality they are deliberate design decisions that have benefits and drawbacks. Maybe this is just semantics, but I feel like it's important to recognise the difference between these two things, because for the most part, true quality of life improvements like making it so you can use multiple soul packets at once, which you couldn't do in the old games, are almost always a good thing. Compared to the remake, the original Demon's Souls had a more consistent and darker art style, combined with a much more foreboding and less bombastic soundtrack that fit the setting much better. The music that plays during the battle with Flamelurker is possibly the best example of this. The new version just doesn't fit the game as well as the old one. Despite all of this, nowadays I would probably still play the remake version if given a choice between the two, which might be an unpopular opinion, because the remake has several substantial quality of life improvements and is still pretty good for the most part. Demon's Souls actually did feature a weight limit system kind of like the one in Fallout, which is much better handled in the remake. It's easy to send an item to Stockpile Thomas if you don't have enough space, which you couldn't do in the original. In that version, you were just straight out of luck. You either had to leave it there, which meant you couldn't get it again for the entire playthrough, or discard something else to make room. The drop rates on certain items have been increased, making farming for upgrade materials much less time consuming, and perhaps most importantly, there are almost no load times in between the different zones. The lengthy loading screens were an issue with the original, and the removal of these makes the game a lot more enjoyable and saves minutes on every single play session. In addition to this, the remake runs at 60 FPS where the original only ran at 30, and that's a huge improvement in and of itself. The more time I spend with a game, the more I care about these kinds of quality of life improvements. It's not that the story and graphics lose all importance, but once you're like 20 playthroughs deep into a game, frustrations like inventory management can become a real drag. And these types of improvements are even more important in multiplayer games and MMOs where the most dedicated players will spend thousands of hours. So in summary, the most underrated feature of Elden Ring is how it maximises convenience for players and reduces time spent on boring, repetitive activities through smart design. With that said, developers should consider carefully whether making their game more convenient is always a good thing, because sometimes features like fast travel can actually have negative consequences on things like immersion. Lastly, quality of life features like UI improvements that don't impact gameplay are almost always a good thing, so I think developers should include these wherever possible in their games to make the experience smoother. Thank you for watching, and I hope you enjoyed it.